Welcome back to my channel, and I am back with 16 more dark screen horror stories with rain effects in the background to fall asleep to. Lay back, relax, and enjoy listening. Madeline could hardly believe her luck. The crumbling mansion she'd found deep in the hills was perfect, exactly what she'd needed for her latest horror video. Her fans had been begging for a new location, something creepier than her last haunted house. This, she thought as she stood outside the looming stone structure, would deliver. Vines crept up the stone walls, and mist clung low to the ground, twisting between the twisted trees. There was a deep, musty smell in the air, and as she stepped closer, a gust of cold wind seemed to shiver through the house, rattling the dark windows. Madeline tightened her grip on her camera and stepped up to the heavy oak door, pushing it open with a creak. Inside, the house was even colder than outside. It wasn't just the damp chill of an old building, either. There was something pressing down on her, making her skin prickle with unease. Shaking it off, she hit record. Hey everyone, welcome back to Haunted Hideouts. Today, we're exploring this abandoned mansion from the 1800s where 10 people mysteriously vanished in a single night. It's got all the classic haunted house vibes, a tragic history, eerie architecture, and apparently some very spooky guests. Her voice echoed in the empty foyer as she moved slowly across the dusty floorboards. Shadows seemed to shift along the walls, but when she looked more closely, there was nothing there. Just the tricks of her camera light, she thought, though her fingers gripped the camera a little tighter. She continued narrating, moving through the hall and shining her flashlight around. The house was immense, a maze of rooms, each furnished with remnants of lives long abandoned. Portraits with staring eyes lined the walls, a thick layer of dust dulling their faces. She tried to ignore them, even as they seemed to follow her movements. As she walked, her light fell on a guest book, lying open on a table in the foyer. She approached, curious, her fingers brushing across the yellowed pages. The names were written in an elegant, looping script, each entry meticulous and almost too perfect. They had a finality to them, as if each name had been written with a sense of grim purpose. She read a few aloud for her audience. Elizabeth Waters, 1912. Henry Tannen, 1917. Anna Coles, 1927. The entries stopped abruptly, right after Anna Cole's name. A sudden knock at the door behind her made her heart leap. She whirled around, her flashlight darting over the empty entryway. No one was there. She tried to laugh it off, chalking it up to the draft, but her hands were shaking as she steadied the camera. She continued exploring, though her nerves were on edge. Her flashlight beam swept across the high ceilings, the ancient furniture draped in white sheets, the broken chandeliers swaying slightly above her. She caught her breath, listening, as she began to hear faint whispers echoing down the hall. They were too quiet to make out, but there was a pleading tone to them, like someone trying to speak from far away. The whispering grew louder as she moved, and her camera started picking up fragments of sound. She stopped, staring at the screen, confused. There was nothing wrong with the audio, but the voices continued to bleed through. "Stay away, guest." She shivered. Her mind told her it was just interference, or maybe some kind of glitch, but the hairs on the back of her neck bristled, and she felt the undeniable weight of someone, or something, watching her. It didn't help that the house felt alive, pulsing with every step she took, like it was breathing around her. Turning a corner, she found herself in a grand ballroom with an enormous mirror hanging on one wall. The mirror was cracked and grimy, but she could still see her reflection, pale and wide-eyed. Just as she was about to turn away, her breath hitched. In the corner of the mirror, barely visible, was a shadow moving behind her. She spun around, camera raised, but the room was empty. She tried to laugh it off, but when she looked back in the mirror, her reflection didn't move. It was just standing there, staring at her, frozen in place. Madeline gasped, taking a step back, but her reflection stayed in the mirror, completely still. Her heart pounded, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped the camera. She forced herself to look away, moving quickly to the door, desperate to put some distance between herself and that room. But as she stepped out, she found herself at the top of a grand staircase lined with portraits. She moved down the steps slowly, shining her light on each painting. The portraits were all of past guests, each one with a serious, almost haunted expression. She couldn't shake the feeling that each person in the paintings was watching her, their eyes dark and knowing. At the bottom of the stairs, she stopped abruptly, her flashlight trained on the last portrait. Her breath caught. It was a woman around her age, wearing an old-fashioned dress. But what chilled her was the woman's face. It looked exactly like her. Madeline took a stumbling step backward, nearly dropping her camera. Her reflection in the ballroom, the whispers, the knock at the door. Every instinct screamed for her to leave. But something seemed to be pulling her deeper into the house, drawing her down the hall toward a door at the far end. With trembling hands, she pushed the door open and found herself in a small, dusty bedroom with a faint, lingering scent of lavender. The walls were faded, peeling. The bed was draped in a layer of dust. She barely registered the details as she turned to leave, but when she opened the door, she froze. She was back in the same bedroom. She blinked, confused, and opened the door again. The same bedroom stared back at her, unchanged, silent. Her heart hammered as she tried a different door, then another, but every exit led her right back to the same spot. A sense of terror closed in on her, squeezing the air from her lungs. The whispers began again, louder, clearer, filling the room with a chorus of voices. "You are the last guest. Leave now," she screamed, dropping her camera as she stumbled back, her fingers clawing at the walls in desperation. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape the bedroom. The room seemed to stretch and warp around her, the walls closing in, trapping her within. Frantic, she turned toward the cracked mirror on the wall, and her breath caught in her throat. Reflected in the glass was a line of ghostly figures, each one watching her with dark, empty eyes. She recognized some of them from the portraits and others from the guest book, past visitors who had vanished, each of them trapped just like her. One by one, they stepped forward, reaching out with cold, translucent hands. She tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness pressing down around her. The figures drew closer, their hands gripping her shoulders, her arms, her face. She felt herself fading, her thoughts blurring as she was pulled deeper into the mirror, her reflection the only thing left of her. In the final moments before the darkness consumed her, she understood. Each guest in the book had come to the house, each one trapped by its endless, echoing halls, fading into shadows until they were nothing more than whispers. Now she was joining them, the latest in a long line of forgotten souls. Her camera lay on the floor, still recording as her voice faded to silence, the room empty once more. The guest book lay open on the table in the foyer, and as if by an unseen hand, a new name began to write itself on the page. Madeline Parker, 2023. The book snapped shut, leaving the house silent, waiting patiently for the next guest. Mason Jones was tired. No, he was exhausted. His YouTube channel, Mystery Trails, was growing fast, but the endless editing, research, and sleepless nights had started taking a toll on him. He needed a video that would take the channel to the next level, something unforgettable. So when he received an email with the subject line, "Come to Briarwood," it piqued his interest. The email was brief, with a cryptic message. "If you want your greatest story yet, come to Briarwood House. No one's been able to stay a full night. See if you can." Attached was an address, Briarwood House, deep in the forest, for hours from the nearest town. Curious, Mason searched for information about the mansion, hoping to find some history. All he uncovered were vague rumors. A cursed house, some tragedies in the family, guests disappearing. There were almost no photos and barely any documentation of what happened to the residents. It was as if the house had been deliberately erased from history. That was enough for Mason. He packed his camera, some lights, a notebook, and enough food for one night. He would drive to the house, film his experience, and return in the morning. It was exactly the type of content his subscribers wanted, and he couldn't pass it up. The drive was long, winding deeper and deeper into a forest where the trees loomed taller than any Mason had ever seen, their gnarled roots twisted like skeletal fingers. By the time he reached Briarwood House, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting eerie shadows across the overgrown lawn. The mansion was enormous, a towering structure that looked as though it had been forgotten for centuries. Ivy crawled up the crumbling stone walls, and all the windows were coated in grime, reflecting nothing but the darkening sky. Mason grabbed his equipment, took a deep breath, and approached the door. Just as he reached for the handle, the door creaked open on its own, revealing a long, dark hallway lined with portraits. The faces in the paintings looked stern, unwelcoming, their eyes seeming to track him as he stepped over the threshold. "Hey everyone, welcome back to Mystery Trails," Mason began, forcing a smile as he started recording. "Tonight, we're exploring Briarwood House, a place so haunted that no one's been able to spend a full night here. Let's see if we can be the first." The silence in the house was thick, almost pressing down on him. Every footstep seemed to echo, lingering longer than it should have, as if the walls were somehow swallowing the sound. Mason took a deep breath and began his exploration. As he moved through the grand hall, he noticed a peculiar smell. It wasn't just the musty scent of an old house. There was something metallic, sharp, almost like blood. He shook it off, blaming his imagination, and continued deeper into the mansion. He entered the dining room, and his flashlight swept across a long, dusty table, set with plates and goblets, each seat still arranged as though waiting for guests. But it was the chairs themselves that gave him pause. Each was draped with a heavy, ornate red cloth, darkened by age but still vibrant, and he had the unsettling feeling that something, or someone, had just been sitting there. His flashlight caught something glinting near the head of the table. Curious, he leaned closer and gasped. Scratched into the wood of the chair was a single word: help. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled, and he glanced around, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. But he was alone, and after taking a few pictures, he moved on, pushing down his growing unease. He made his way down another hallway, past cracked wallpaper and dusty sconces, when he found an open door leading to a small study. There was a large desk in the center of the room, covered in a thick layer of dust. But what caught his eye was an old leather-bound journal lying on top, untouched by time. He hesitated, then picked it up, opening to the first page. April 13th, 1874. They had begun appearing in my dreams. Every night, the same faces, their eyes hollow, their mouths forming words I cannot hear. I cannot leave the house. They will not let me. Mason flipped to another entry, feeling a chill creep up his spine. May 3rd, 1874. They grow angrier each night. They say I have forgotten them. I do not know what they mean. I am the only one here, but their voices grow louder. Soon, I fear I shall join them. The last entry was nearly illegible, as though written by a trembling hand. They are no longer in my dreams. They are here, standing by my bed as I write this. Their hands are cold, and they whisper that I am to be one of them. Mason's hands shook as he closed the journal. The air in the room had turned frigid, and he could swear he heard faint whispers coming from somewhere nearby. Ignoring the panic rising in his chest, he pressed on, determined to capture more footage. He explored further, moving upstairs, where the air grew colder with every step. At the top of the staircase, he found himself in a long hallway lined with closed doors. He opened the first one and stepped inside, finding a bedroom shrouded in dust. The bed was still made, a thick quilt draped over it, and an old mirror stood in the corner, clouded with age. As he examined it, he noticed something strange. His reflection was there, but it wasn't right. His eyes looked sunken, his face pale. But as he looked closer, he saw movement, a faint, shadowy figure behind him. He spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just the empty room. When he turned back to the mirror, his reflection had changed. He was himself again, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching him. Leaving the room quickly, he opened another door down the hall. This room was different, a nursery. Toys lay scattered on the floor, covered in dust, and a small crib stood in the corner. Mason's flashlight swept across the room, illuminating a doll sitting on a rocking chair. Its glassy eyes seemed to stare right at him. He stepped closer, feeling uneasy, and reached out to touch it. The moment his fingers brushed its porcelain face, he heard it, a faint giggle, high-pitched and chilling, echoing through the room. He jumped back, his heart racing, and his flashlight flickered. Just then, a creaking sound came from behind him. He turned slowly, flashlight trembling in his hand, and saw the crib moving, rocking gently back and forth as if someone were still lying there. He backed out of the room, nearly tripping over his own feet, and slammed the door shut, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He could still hear the giggle echoing in his mind, and his only thought was to leave, to get out of the house and never look back. But as he turned to go back downstairs, he realized something was wrong. The hallway was different. The doors seemed to stretch endlessly, twisting in angles that shouldn't have been possible. His own footsteps felt distant, as if the floor itself was absorbing them, and every door he tried led to the same long, impossible hallway. Panic set in as he tried door after door, each one leading nowhere. His breathing grew frantic, and he could feel a suffocating weight pressing down on him. The whispers began again, louder this time, surrounding him, filling the air with a dreadful chant. "You have forgotten us. You will stay with us. Forever." Desperate, he turned to the last door at the end of the hall and threw it open. He stumbled into a room he hadn't seen before, a grand library with towering bookshelves, stretching up to a ceiling lost in darkness. In the center of the room was a massive chair, and seated in it was a figure dressed in black, its face hidden in shadow. The figure lifted its head, revealing hollow eyes, empty and dark, and its mouth stretched into a chilling smile. "You've come to join us, Mason," it whispered, the voice echoing through the room. Mason staggered back, his body frozen in terror, as the figure rose and began to approach him. He turned to run, but his feet wouldn't move, his legs like lead. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure reached out, its hand cold as ice, and pressed its fingers against his forehead. Suddenly, he was overwhelmed with visions, faces, dozens of them, each one twisted in fear, each one pleading forgotten. They were the past guests, those who had entered Briarwood House, each trapped forever in its walls. And he could feel himself becoming one of them, his body fading, his mind sinking into darkness. The last thing he saw before everything went black was his own face in the mirror across the room, staring back at him, hollow and lifeless. Days passed, and Briarwood House remained silent, waiting. The video Mason had recorded would never be uploaded. The camera, abandoned on the dusty floor, continued to roll, capturing only silence. And in the guest book on the table in the foyer, another name appeared, scratched in by an unseen hand. Mason Jones, 2023. The house was patient. It knew there would be more visitors. There were always more guests who would come, searching for answers, unaware that they, too, would become one of the forgotten ones. When Samara's grandmother died, she left her granddaughter a single inheritance, her house on Black Hollow Road, a place Samara had only visited once as a child. It was the sort of house that, even in daylight, had seemed to breathe with its own life, its wooden bones creaking and sighing in a language she hadn't wanted to understand. The inheritance came with a condition. Samara had to live there for 30 nights to claim ownership. And so, with little choice, Samara arrived on a misty October afternoon, pulling up to the foreboding silhouette of the house. It was just as she remembered, tall, narrow, and shadowed by towering trees that whispered in the wind. The shutters hung crookedly, the windows were dark and uninviting, and ivy had begun to reclaim parts of the walls. Samara shivered as she stepped out of her car, feeling as though she were stepping into another world. She unlocked the front door and walked into the house, the air thick with the scent of dust and something else, something bitter and metallic. She turned on the lights, casting a warm but feeble glow on the aging wallpaper and creaking floorboards. Her grandmother's belongings were all still there, frozen in time. A book left open on the armchair, knitting needles resting in half-finished fabric. Taking a deep breath, Samara forced herself to settle in. She set her bags down, explored the rooms, and turned on her phone to start recording a video for her friends. "Hey guys," she said with a strained laugh. "I'm officially in Grandma's creepy old house. Let's hope I survive the 30 days. She laughed, but the empty silence that followed seemed to swallow the sound. The first night was quiet. Samara lay in bed, listening to the wind rustling the trees outside and the occasional creak from the house settling. She drifted into an uneasy sleep, haunted by strange dreams of empty rooms and flickering lights. On the second night, she was woken by a noise, a soft whispering sound, almost like the rustle of fabric. Sitting up, she looked around her dark room, her heart racing. The house was silent again. She lay back down, telling herself it was nothing, that old houses made noises at night. But then, on the third night, she heard it again, a faint, rhythmic creaking sound coming from the hallway. She got up, clutching her phone as a flashlight, and stepped into the corridor. The noise was louder out here, a slow, methodical creak, like someone rocking back and forth. It led her down the stairs, guiding her toward the living room. Her flashlight caught the shape of her grandmother's favorite rocking chair, swaying back and forth on its own. She froze, unable to move, as the chair creaked louder, as though an invisible figure were rocking in it, staring straight at her. A cold chill swept over her. She forced herself to step back, to breathe, to tell herself that she was just tired. But as she turned to go back upstairs, she heard it, a voice, faint and scratchy, whispering from the direction of the chair. "Samara!" She bolted up the stairs, slamming the bedroom door behind her. She barely slept that night, listening for any sound, her mind racing with dread. The next morning, Samara tried to rationalize what she had heard. It was probably just her imagination, she told herself, nothing more. But the incidents continued. On the fifth night, she woke to the sound of soft laughter outside her door. When she opened it, she found the hallway empty, but there were faint footprints in the dust leading to her room. The laughter faded, but as she stood there, she heard something new, a distant, echoing sound, like voices layered upon each other, coming from somewhere deep within the house. The sixth night was worse. She was lying in bed, trying to sleep, when she felt a pressure on the edge of her mattress. It was as though someone had sat down next to her, weighing down the springs. Her blood ran cold as she dared to turn her head, but there was no one there. Just the imprint of an invisible hand on the blanket, as if reaching out to touch her. Terrified, she spent the rest of the night sitting against the headboard, her eyes wide open, waiting for morning. Days turned to nights, and the strange occurrences escalated. On the 8th night, Samara found herself standing in front of a locked door in the attic that she had no memory of opening. The door was heavy, made of solid wood, with a brass handle that seemed to hum beneath her touch. When she pushed it open, she was met with a cold blast of air. Inside, the room was pitch black, and as she stepped inside, she felt a strange sense of familiarity, as though she'd been here before. Her flashlight barely penetrated the darkness, and she had the unsettling feeling that something was watching her from the corners. Then she noticed the walls. They were covered in words, carved deeply into the wood, each word desperate and frantic. She leaned closer, squinting to make them out. "Help! Stay away! They listen! She's watching!" The words circled around the room, each one more frenzied than the last. In the center of the floor was a large, crude circle, surrounded by strange symbols she didn't recognize. As she stood there, trying to make sense of it, she heard a whisper in her ear. "Samara, come closer." She ran from the attic, her heart pounding, and locked herself in her bedroom, terrified and unable to shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The nights that followed became a blur of dread and terror. The voices grew louder, their whispers following her through the house, relentless and suffocating. Sometimes she'd hear her grandmother's voice, gentle and warm, calling her name. Other times it was a voice she didn't recognize, harsh and angry, demanding that she leave. By the 14th night, Samara was on the verge of collapse. She hadn't slept more than a few hours, and her mind was fraying under the relentless onslaught of voices and shadows. Desperate, she went to the attic again, searching for answers, hoping to find some clue as to why her grandmother had wanted her to stay in this cursed place. As she entered the strange room again, she noticed something she hadn't before. A book lying in the center of the circle, bound in dark leather, its pages yellowed with age. She opened it, her hands shaking, and began to read. The book was filled with her grandmother's handwriting, detailing years of strange encounters, whispers in the night, visions of shadowy figures watching her from the corners. Her grandmother had believed the house was haunted, that spirits were trapped here, bound to the walls and floors, forced to relive their deaths night after night. But there was more. The last entry, scrawled in hurried, frantic letters, chilled Samara to her core. "They want a new soul. I'm growing weaker, and they know it. They've chosen her, my granddaughter, to take my place. The house won't let her leave. She must stay for 30 days. God forgive me." Samara dropped the book, her mind reeling. Her grandmother had known about this, had known that the house was waiting, that it needed a new soul. She had been lured here, trapped in this twisted inheritance. She had to get out, now. Samara grabbed her things and ran down the stairs, but as she reached the front door, she felt an overwhelming force pushing her back. The air grew heavy, thick, pressing down on her chest. She could hear the voices, louder now, surrounding her, echoing off the walls. "Stay! Stay with us, Samara!" Desperate, she fought against the invisible force, clawing at the door handle. But it wouldn't budge. She was trapped, just as her grandmother had been, ensnared by the house's insidious grip. The lights flickered, and in the brief moments of darkness, she saw them, shadowy figures lining the walls, their faces gaunt, eyes empty and accusing. They were the spirits bound to the house, prisoners of its curse, and now they were reaching out to her, their hands cold and spectral, their voices a terrible chorus. Stay with us." The next day, the neighbors found Samara's car parked outside, but the house was silent. They knocked, but no one answered. Days turned into weeks, and still, there was no sign of Samara. The house remained dark and quiet, as if it had gone back to sleep, waiting patiently for its next visitor. Inside, the guest book in the foyer lay open, a single name scrawled on its last page. Samara Blake, 2023. The house would wait. It always did. And someday, someone else would answer its call, unaware of the whispers, the shadows, and the unbreakable bond that would trap them in the House of Echoes. It was supposed to be an escape, a month spent writing in peace, far from the chaos of the city. June Williams rented an old Victorian house at the edge of Sable Woods, a place so remote it didn't even show up on most maps. She thought the isolation would be perfect, no neighbors, no distractions, only the quiet, creaky old house and the dense woods surrounding it. The house was beautiful in its own haunting way. Dark wood paneling lined the walls, and tall windows looked out onto a sprawling, tangled garden, overgrown and nearly devoured by the forest. Every room seemed to have a story etched into its faded wallpaper and tarnished brass fixtures. The owner, an older woman with piercing gray eyes, had handed her the key with a warning: stay inside at night. Keep the windows closed and locked. June had laughed it off, assuming it was just some local superstition or an attempt to scare a city girl. Her first week in the house was uneventful. June spent her days writing, occasionally wandering the property, intrigued by the oddities she kept finding: a broken stone statue partially hidden by ivy, an old fountain filled with stagnant water, a wooden swing that creaked in the breeze. But on the seventh night, something changed. She was sitting in the living room, editing her latest chapter, when she felt it, the undeniable sensation of being watched. She glanced at the window, expecting to see an animal or maybe a stray branch casting shadows. But there was nothing. Shrugging it off, she returned to her work, but the feeling persisted, prickling at the back of her neck. She glanced at the window again. This time, her heart skipped a beat. Outside, just beyond the glass, she thought she saw a figure, a shadowy shape, standing motionless, just watching her. She froze, her eyes fixed on the figure, but in an instant, it was gone, as if it had slipped into the trees. June forced herself to laugh, blaming her overactive imagination, but she felt unsettled. She double-checked the locks on the windows before going to bed, though she couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still out there. The next morning, she checked the garden but found no footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. She told herself it was nothing, a trick of the light, maybe even her own reflection. But that night, the feeling returned. As she sat by the window writing, her eyes kept darting up, looking for movement outside. Hours passed, and just as she was about to give up and go to bed, she saw it again. The same shadowy figure stood at the edge of the trees, closer this time, staring at her through the window. Its face was indistinct, hidden in shadow, but she could sense its eyes on her, piercing and cold. June's pulse quickened as she backed away from the window. She fumbled for her phone, planning to call someone, anyone, but there was no signal this deep in the woods. She spent the rest of the night sitting on her bed, staring at the door, her heart pounding, feeling as though something was lurking just outside, waiting. The following nights were worse. The figure grew bolder, standing closer to the house, sometimes even appearing at different windows. Once, she woke in the middle of the night to find it standing at her bedroom window, so close that she could almost make out its face. It was pale, with eyes like dark, empty voids, and its mouth was twisted in a grimace that sent chills through her entire body. Panicked, she tried to leave the house, packing her bags and heading for her car. But when she reached it, the engine wouldn't start. She tried over and over, but it was as if the car were dead, completely drained of power. Defeated, she trudged back to the house, locking the door behind her, trapped. Over the next few days, June barely slept. She moved from room to room, trying to stay one step ahead of the figure, but it always seemed to know where she was. During the day, it would vanish, leaving her in agonizing silence. But as soon as night fell, it would return, always watching, always closer. Then, on the 15th night, she couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed a flashlight and stormed outside, determined to confront whatever was haunting her. The garden was pitch dark, the trees casting long shadows under the pale moonlight. She moved cautiously, scanning the area, her flashlight shaking in her hand. "Who are you?" she called out, her voice echoing through the empty woods. "Why are you following me?" There was no response. The only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind. She turned to go back inside when she heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible. "June!" She whipped around, shining her flashlight wildly. The whisper grew louder, repeating her name, coming from somewhere deep in the woods. Her breath hitched, but something compelled her forward, as if she were being drawn toward the sound. The voice led her deeper into the forest, past twisted trees and overgrown paths she hadn't seen before. Finally, she reached a clearing, and in the center was an old well, covered in moss and half hidden by undergrowth. The whisper was louder here, echoing up from the depths of the well. "June!" Her flashlight flickered as she leaned over the edge, peering into the darkness. She could see nothing, only an endless black void. But as she stood there, staring, she felt something cold and damp brush against her hand. She yanked her hand back, but it was too late. A skeletal hand shot up from the darkness, its fingers thin and claw-like, grasping at her wrist. She screamed, stumbling back, and the hand disappeared, sinking back into the darkness. June ran back to the house, slamming the door behind her, her chest heaving. She had no explanation for what she had seen, but one thing was clear. Whatever was in the woods wasn't just watching her. It was calling her, drawing her closer, and it wasn't going to stop. That night, the figure appeared again, but this time, it was inside the house. She heard the floorboards creak, the sound growing louder, closer, until she could feel its presence just outside her bedroom door. She pressed herself against the wall, holding her breath as the door slowly creaked open. The figure stepped inside, tall and dark, its face hidden in shadow. She felt her blood turn to ice as it moved closer, standing at the foot of her bed, watching her with those hollow, empty eyes. "Why are you here?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure tilted its head, almost as if it were studying her, and then it spoke, its voice cold and hollow. "I was here long before you, June. This house belongs to me." Its words sent a shiver down her spine, and she suddenly understood. This wasn't just a ghost. It was something darker, something tied to the very walls of the house, something that had been watching her from the beginning, waiting for her to come. The figure leaned closer, its face inches from hers, and she could see it now. Pale, gaunt, with eyes that seemed to pull her in, like black holes consuming everything in their path. "Leave me alone," she whispered, her voice trembling. The figure only smiled, its expression twisted and cruel. "You can never leave," it said softly. "Not until you understand." With that, it reached out, pressing its icy fingers against her forehead. A wave of darkness washed over her, and suddenly she was somewhere else. She was standing in the same house, but it was different, newer, brighter. She could hear laughter, voices echoing from the hallway. And then a scream. She turned, and there was the figure, dragging a woman down the hallway, its grip tight around her throat. The woman's face was twisted in terror, and her eyes met June's for a brief, agonizing moment before the figure pulled her into the darkness. The vision faded, and June found herself back in her bed, gasping for breath. The figure was gone, but its words echoed in her mind. "Not until you understand." Over the next few days, June began piecing together the truth. She found old newspaper clippings hidden in the attic, detailing a series of disappearances linked to the house. Each story was the same. Someone moved in, began seeing things, hearing voices, and eventually vanished without a trace. She knew now that the figure wasn't just a ghost. It was something bound to the house, something that had taken the lives of its previous inhabitants and was now after her. And it wouldn't stop until she joined them. On the 30th night, June made a decision. She packed her bags and left, leaving everything behind. She didn't look back, didn't stop driving until she was far from the house, far from its dark secrets. But even as she left, she could still feel it watching her, its cold eyes lingering in her mind. She had escaped, but she knew deep down that it was only a matter of time before it found her again. After all, the house never let its visitors go. "20 years ago, an entire family mysteriously vanished from their home at 313 Evergreen Lane. Every piece of furniture was left in place, untouched, as if they had simply walked out and never returned. Neighbors in the small town of Cypress Grove were shocked and disturbed. The Reeds, a family of 4, had always seemed perfectly normal. One day, they were simply gone. Their car was parked in the driveway, lights flickered inside the house, and breakfast plates were set at the kitchen table, untouched. The police investigation lasted months, but no trace of the family was ever found. Rumors spread quickly, with some saying the house was cursed, that it was a gateway to another world. But the case went cold, and the house remained abandoned, slowly gathering dust, untouched and forgotten. 20 years later, James Harlow, a journalist on the brink of losing his job, was handed a last chance at redemption. A feature on the haunted house of Cypress Grove. James, who had recently experienced his own personal losses, felt a strange draw to the story, a need to uncover the truth about the Reed family's disappearance. Driven by a mix of ambition and desperation, he proposed the idea of living in the house himself for a month, documenting everything he experienced. To his surprise, his editor agreed, eager for the haunting tale that would undoubtedly sell. James packed his bags and drove out to Evergreen Lane, certain that this story would be his big break. When James arrived, the house stood before him like a looming shadow, tall and dark against the fading daylight. The windows were dusty, the garden overgrown, and yet everything inside seemed frozen in time, just as it had been the day the Reeds disappeared. The air was thick with an unexplainable stillness. He pushed open the heavy front door, which creaked loudly, and found himself standing in the entryway, surrounded by an eerie silence. He noticed that old clothes still hung in the closets, and a family portrait rested on the mantel, covered in dust but preserved as though someone had been dusting around it for years. James tried to shake off the unease and focus on the task at hand. He would document everything, stay rational, and finally uncover the truth. That first night, he set up his recording equipment, prepared to capture any unusual sounds or sightings. He sat by the living room window, typing out his initial impressions of the house, when a chill ran down his spine. It was as though someone were watching him, just beyond the glass. He glanced up but saw only the darkened garden and the silhouettes of twisted trees against the sky. He brushed it off as nerves and went to bed, telling himself he would find something of substance in the coming days. But that night, he barely slept. Strange sounds filled the house, whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves, faint and unintelligible like distant voices. Footsteps creaked in the hallway outside his room, growing louder and then fading, only to return moments later. In his dreams, he saw flashes of the Reed family. A mother rocking a child in the corner of his room, a father staring blankly into a mirror, and two children giggling somewhere in the darkness. When he woke in the morning, he found himself drenched in sweat, his hands shaking. The following day, while exploring the study, James discovered a journal tucked beneath a loose floorboard. The handwriting was neat, precise, and almost clinical. The journal belonged to Daniel Reed, the father of the family, who had kept a meticulous account of each day in the house. The entries began with ordinary details, daily routines, observations about his children. But as James read further, the tone shifted. Daniel began describing odd occurrences, strange, whispering voices that his wife had heard at night, cold drafts that followed his children, and a presence that seemed to lurk just beyond their sight. James felt a chill as he read one entry dated a week before the family vanished. Lily says he comes to her at night, stands in the corner of her room. She says he's watching, waiting. I thought it was just her imagination, but last night I heard him too, standing in the hall, whispering her name. From that night on, James began experiencing the same phenomena described in the journal. Objects moved on their own. A chair was dragged across the room, lights flickered, and doors opened and closed despite him locking them. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, making him feel as though invisible eyes followed his every movement. He tried to ignore it, but the sensation was relentless. Determined to capture proof, he set up cameras throughout the house. The footage showed shadows moving without any source of light, a dark figure appearing at the end of the hallway, and an audio recording that caught a faint, eerie lullaby playing as though it came from the very walls. Each night, the whispering grew louder, filling his ears with low, guttural sounds that seemed to speak to him. The words became clearer with each passing night. Join us, you can't leave, we're waiting. His sleep grew fitful, plagued by nightmares. He tried calling his editor, desperate for an outside voice, but his calls dropped, and his emails went unanswered. It was as if he'd been severed from the outside world, left alone in the house with whatever was lurking within. On the 10th night, driven by a need for answers, James decided to investigate the basement. Daniel Reed's journal had made several references to it, calling it a place of rot and where the voices are strongest. Despite the creeping dread, James descended the basement stairs, his flashlight casting eerie shadows on the damp stone walls. The air grew colder, thick with a rancid stench that made his stomach turn. At the far end of the basement, he found a hidden door, its frame barely visible against the wall. The door creaked as it opened, revealing a small, pitch-black room. In the center of the floor was a large, circular symbol, its lines cracked with age and surrounded by burnt-out candle stubs and dried herbs. Scattered around the symbol were remnants of old clothing and toys, items that had clearly belonged to the Reed children. As he stepped closer, he heard his name, whispered faintly but unmistakably. He turned, flashlight shaking in his hand, but the room was empty. The whisper grew louder, echoing around him, filling the small space until it was all he could hear, a cacophony of voices calling him from the shadows. Panicked, James fled up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind him. But the whispers continued to haunt him, following him through the house, repeating his name over and over. Each night, they grew louder, more insistent, as though something in the house had awakened and was calling him closer. Desperate for answers, he returned to Daniel's journal, flipping frantically through the pages until he found a final, chilling entry, dated just one day before the family disappeared. We cannot leave. I see it now. The house won't let us go. It needs us, demands something from us. And now, I fear it's too late. I can feel it watching, waiting. And tonight, we'll be with it, one way or another. A wave of horror washed over him as he realized the truth. The house didn't just haunt those who entered, it consumed them. The Reed family hadn't left. They were still there, bound to the house by some ancient, dark force that fed on their souls. And now, that same force was coming for him. He gathered his things, tried to leave, but every door and window refused to open. It was as if an invisible hand held them shut, trapping him inside. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape. James spent the following days wandering the house, his mind unraveling as the voices grew louder and the shadows seemed to close in. He began seeing the Reeds, their ghostly figures appearing in the corners of rooms, watching him with hollow eyes filled with sorrow. They reached out to him, their mouths moving silently as though trying to warn him, but their words were drowned out by the constant, insistent whispering. On the 30th night, James recorded his last entry, describing the figure that stood at the end of his bed, watching him with eyes as dark as the void, a twisted grin spreading across its pale face. He knew, in that moment, that he would never leave the house. He understood now why the Reeds had disappeared, why the house had remained empty for so long. It wasn't just haunted, it was alive, a malevolent force that consumed anyone who dared to enter. A month later, a search team found the house empty. James Harlow had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only his notes and his half-finished article. His belongings were scattered throughout the house, as if he had simply walked out and disappeared. Cypress Grove added another name to the list of those lost to 313 Evergreen Lane, and the house remained empty once more, waiting, watching, ready to claim its next victim. But if you listen closely, as the townspeople of Cypress Grove would say, you might still hear them, the whispers of the forgotten, echoing through the empty halls, calling out for help that will never come. One chilly autumn night, the night shift radio host Annie Redman's quiet shift was broken by a call that would change everything. The station was a small, independent operation nestled in the quiet town of Fenton Hill, and Annie's show had a modest following. Most listeners were local night owls and the occasional insomniac. Her job was simple: play a mix of classic rock, take the occasional call, and chat with the locals who felt like sharing a thought or a story. It was nearing 2 a.m., and the town was deathly quiet as her show after midnight hummed through the airwaves. Annie was in the middle of announcing a track by Fleetwood Mac when the phone line lit up with an incoming call. The caller ID read unknown number, but Annie knew it was likely just another late-night listener. She cleared her throat and hit the line. "Good evening, Fenton Hill. This is Annie Redman, and you're on the air. What's on your mind?" A long silence followed, the line eerily still. She frowned, listening. In the background, she thought she could hear something faint, a strange rhythmic clicking noise. "Hello," she asked. "Anyone there?" Another pause. "I need help," a man's voice whispered finally, sounding as if it were coming from far away, muffled and weak. "Please." Annie's hand froze over the soundboard. Something in the man's voice was off, a rough, rattling quality, as though he were gasping for air. Despite herself, a prickle of dread ran down her spine. "Sir, can you tell me where you are? Do you need emergency services?" she asked, her voice instinctively quiet. The man took a shuddering breath, the sound garbled by static. "I'm lost. I'm trapped. It's dark. It's so dark here." She sat up straighter, suddenly alert. "Where are you? Are you in Fenton Hill?" "No, not Fenton. Not anymore." His voice was a rasp, barely audible. "They took me. I can't see. Who took you? Where are you? Please don't let them." The voice broke off into a series of short, desperate breaths, and Annie felt a chill settle in her bones. "Sir, who are they? Can you describe anything around you? I can try to help if I know where you are." But there was only a rustling, a sickly, dragging sound on the other end of the line. I'm so sorry." The voice faded out, a whisper dissolving into static, and then the line went dead. Annie stared at the phone, her fingers hovering above the controls, trying to process what she had just heard. It had felt so real, so urgent. But then, she'd had her share of prank callers. Fenton Hill was full of characters who loved to pull her leg. Maybe this was just someone's twisted idea of a joke. She pushed it from her mind and continued with her set list, the music filling the silence. Still, every time she closed her eyes, she heard that voice again, echoing in her mind. "Please don't let them." The following night, Annie was back in the studio, and she'd almost forgotten about the strange call. Almost. It was past midnight, and the station's lobby lights were flickering, casting odd shadows that seemed to shift and sway across the walls. Annie brushed it off, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. It was just her imagination, she told herself. She went on with her show, the music playing softly as she flipped through records, trying to ignore the nagging unease that kept creeping in. Then, at 1:58 a.m., the phone rang again. The caller ID was once more blank. Her stomach twisted as she stared at it, a growing sense of dread taking root. She reached out, fingers hesitant, but finally pressed the button. Fenton Hill Radio, this is Annie Redman. A familiar, rattling breath filled the line, labored and shaky. It was him, the same caller from the night before. Annie, he whispered, his voice strained and barely above a whisper. Her heart pounded in her chest. Yes, this is Annie. Are you all right? Do you need help? I'm trapped. His voice sounded weaker, as though he were slipping further away. You have to don't let them in. Let who in? She demanded, her voice low but urgent. Please, Annie, they're coming. The line went dead again. She sat there, gripping the phone, the room around her suddenly cold and still. She had the distinct feeling that she was not alone. She scanned the empty studio, but no one was there. Just the dark, silent control room, empty save for her and the faint hum of the equipment. But as she hung up, she noticed something strange. A light on the switchboard was blinking. It was connected to a remote frequency, one the station didn't typically use. Curiosity won over her fear, and she flicked the switch. A faint, static-filled signal filled the room, and Annie adjusted the dial, trying to clear it up. There, under the crackling, she heard it, a distant, hollow voice chanting in a language she didn't recognize. It was rhythmic, repetitive, almost like a ritual. A chill ran through her as she listened, unable to pull herself away. The chanting grew louder, filling the small room, a cacophony of alien words that clawed at her mind. Just as she was about to turn it off, the chanting stopped abruptly, leaving only an eerie, empty silence. And then a new voice spoke through the speakers, a voice that was neither the callers nor the chanting. This voice was deep, resonant, and dripping with malice. Annie Redman, it said, her name hanging in the air like a threat. Annie slammed the switch off, heart racing, her hands shaking. How had it known her name? She wanted to leave, to run from the station and not look back. But her hands were rooted to the desk, her body frozen by a strange compulsion. Her gaze drifted to the window overlooking the studio's hallway, and that's when she saw it. A figure stood just outside, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, unnaturally thin, with limbs too long, too wrong. The figure's head was tilted at an odd angle, as if observing her, studying her. She felt a wave of dread so powerful it nearly choked her. Annie! The voice crackled over the intercom, though she hadn't touched the switch. Her breath hitched as the figure took a step closer to the glass, its shadowed face twisting into a grin. Her mind raced. She needed to get out, to escape this nightmare, but every muscle in her body felt paralyzed. The figure's hand, pale and bony, reached up, pressing against the glass. She could see it clearly now, a twisted, inhuman face with hollow eyes that seemed to absorb the light around them. The chanting returned, faint but growing, filling the room with that same rhythmic, unsettling sound. The walls felt as though they were closing in, the air thick and oppressive. Just as she thought she couldn't take it anymore, the figure vanished, leaving only a faint smear on the glass where its hand had pressed. Annie bolted from her chair, heart racing, and ran out of the studio, down the hall, and into the safety of the lobby. She pulled out her phone, desperate to call someone, anyone. But as she dialed, the line was silent. Dead. Just like the mysterious calls. She was trapped. The chanting continued, louder now, as though it were coming from the very walls. She backed away, stumbling over her feet, her eyes darting around, searching for any way out. Then, as if drawn by some unseen force, she found herself back in the studio, her hand reaching for the switch on the soundboard. Her fingers trembled, but she couldn't stop herself. She flicked it on, and the chanting filled the room once more, drowning her in its relentless rhythm. And then, amid the chanting, she heard the caller's voice one last time. Annie, I'm sorry. I tried to warn you. The line went silent, the chanting fading into a low hum. The room was empty, the lights flickering softly, as though nothing had happened. But Annie knew she was no longer alone. She could feel them, the figures that lurked just beyond her sight, waiting in the shadows, watching her every move. She knew that she had let them in, that she was now part of whatever haunted the airwaves, whatever dark force had called out to her from beyond. And as she sat there, her eyes vacant, her voice cracked and hollow, she leaned into the microphone and spoke, her words echoing through the empty town, calling out to the next listener, the next victim. "Good evening, Fenton Hill," she said, her voice trembling with a strange, unnatural echo. "This is Annie Redman, and you're on the air." Maggie's hands shook as she turned the key to the old iron gate of Ravenswood Cemetery. The job had seemed simple enough on paper. Part-time night guard at the town cemetery. It was only supposed to be temporary, something to hold her over until she found something better. But now, standing under the cold, pale moonlight, she began to wonder if she'd made a terrible mistake. The townspeople had warned her that Ravenswood wasn't like other cemeteries. The graves were ancient, some predating the founding of the town itself. Local legend held that Ravenswood was a place of unrest, a boundary between the living and the dead that was thinner than most. The previous guards hadn't lasted more than a few weeks, each one leaving without explanation, eyes haunted and mouths tightly shut. "Don't stay there past midnight," one of the townsfolk had whispered to her as she'd collected her new uniform. Strange things happen after midnight, but Maggie needed the money and wasn't about to be scared off by a few ghost stories. She'd always had a stubborn streak, and besides, she didn't believe in the supernatural. She tightened her scarf around her neck, grabbed her flashlight, and stepped inside the cemetery, letting the gate close with a clang that echoed through the empty grounds. The first hour passed quietly. The wind whistled softly through the twisted branches of the old oaks, and the leaves crunched beneath her boots. She made her rounds, checking the edges of the cemetery and the mausoleums. Everything was calm, and Maggie began to relax, feeling a bit silly for being so nervous. She leaned against a large, moss-covered tombstone, breathing in the crisp night air and listening to the quiet rustle of the trees. It was just past midnight when she heard it, the faint sound of footsteps on the gravel path behind her. She turned, shining her flashlight down the path, but there was nothing there. Just shadows stretching out beneath the gnarled branches and the faint, shifting light of the moon. "Probably just an animal," she muttered to herself, trying to ignore the chill creeping up her spine. But the footsteps came again, closer this time, and she felt an uneasy prickle at the back of her neck. She turned sharply, but once more the path was empty. "Hello," she called out, her voice sounding smaller than she'd intended. "Is anyone there?" Only silence answered her. She tried to laugh it off, shaking her head at her own nerves, but something about the quiet felt wrong. The air was thick, almost stifling, and the cemetery seemed to grow darker, the shadows lengthening as though they were reaching out to her. Suddenly, her flashlight flickered, casting strange, distorted shadows across the gravestones. She smacked it against her palm, muttering under her breath as the light steadied, but her heart was racing. She tried to focus, reminding herself that she was alone. But as she turned to continue her rounds, she saw it, movement in the corner of her eye. A dark figure stood at the far end of the cemetery, half hidden behind an ancient mausoleum. Maggie's breath caught in her throat as she squinted, trying to make out the figure's features. "Hey!" she called out, her voice echoing through the night. "You're not supposed to be here." The figure didn't move. It stood still, cloaked in shadow, its form unnaturally tall and thin. Maggie felt a shiver run down her spine. She took a step forward, lifting her flashlight, but the figure vanished, slipping back into the darkness like a wisp of smoke. Her heartbeat quickened as she scanned the cemetery, trying to make sense of what she'd just seen. "It's just your imagination," she whispered, trying to calm herself. "It's late. You're tired." But as she walked on, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every shadow seemed to shift, every gust of wind seemed to carry a faint whisper. She kept her flashlight trained on the ground, focusing on her steps, and told herself that she just needed to get through the night. But then she noticed something strange. Ahead of her, just a few feet away, was a single, fresh footprint in the gravel. It was large, far larger than her own, and facing directly toward her. Her heart skipped a beat as she stared at it, then lifted her flashlight to the path ahead. She gasped, her blood running cold. The figure was there again, standing just beyond the reach of her light. It was closer now, its features still hidden, but she could make out more of its form. Its limbs were impossibly long, stretched and twisted, and its head was cocked to the side as though watching her with silent, eerie curiosity. Maggie took a step back, her mind racing with thoughts of escape, but her feet felt rooted to the ground. The figure moved, gliding forward without a sound, its body flowing like liquid shadow. She could feel its gaze, cold and piercing, and she was filled with the sudden, overwhelming urge to run. But before she could move, the figure vanished again, melting into the shadows as though it had never been there. Maggie's breathing was shallow and rapid as she stumbled back, her flashlight trembling in her grip. She couldn't stay here, not with whatever that thing was lurking in the darkness. She turned and broke into a run, her footsteps echoing in the silence as she sprinted down the path toward the gate. But as she neared the entrance, she skidded to a halt, her heart sinking. The gate was closed. She'd left it unlocked, hadn't she? She fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking as she tried to find the right one. But as she slid it into the lock, a cold breeze swept over her, and the hair on the back of her neck prickled. She turned slowly, the flashlight clutched tightly in her hand. There, standing just a few feet away, was the figure. It was close enough now that she could make out its face, or the lack of one. Its head was smooth and featureless, a dark void where eyes, a mouth, and a nose should have been. It tilted its head toward her, the darkness seeming to pulse and ripple around it. "Why are you here?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, her hand frozen on the gate. The figure's head tilted again, and for a moment, she thought she could hear something, a low, rasping whisper, like the rustle of leaves. But the sound was just beyond comprehension, a language that twisted and curled around her mind, filling her with a sense of dread. Without another thought, she flung open the gate and bolted out of the cemetery, running as fast as her legs would carry her. She didn't stop until she was halfway home, panting and clutching her chest, her mind reeling from what she'd seen. The next day, she went to the cemetery office and told her supervisor everything. She half expected him to laugh or accuse her of making it up, but his face grew pale, and he looked at her with an expression of horror. "You saw the keeper," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "The keeper?" He nodded, his gaze distant. "It's an old legend. They say the keeper was once a man who watched over the cemetery centuries ago. But he did something terrible, something that cursed him to an eternity in Ravenswood. Now he wanders the grounds, watching, waiting, and he doesn't like intruders." Maggie felt a chill settle over her. "I'm not going back there," she said firmly. Her supervisor nodded, his face grim. "I don't blame you." But that night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her room was quiet, the only sound her own breathing, but she felt the same prickling sensation on the back of her neck. Slowly, she turned her head toward the window. And there, standing in the moonlight just outside her window, was the keeper. His featureless face was tilted toward her, his form as dark and twisted as it had been in the cemetery. Maggie's breath caught in her throat as she scrambled out of bed, backing away from the window. But when she looked back, the figure was gone, leaving only the faint impression of a shadow on the glass. From that night on, the keeper was always there, lurking just at the edge of her vision, waiting and watching. She quit her job, left Fenton Hill, but the keeper followed her, appearing in every dark corner, every shadowed alley. She would catch glimpses of him in reflections, his form blending into the darkness, but always there, always watching. Maggie knew she would never be free of him, that he had marked her somehow. She had seen the keeper of Ravenswood Cemetery, and now he would haunt her forever, a silent, faceless figure, waiting to claim her for the darkness. And no matter how far she ran, she knew that eventually he would find her. Her heart skipped back to my channel with 15 more black lifted her flashlight to the path ahead. She gasped, "Close your eyes and relax, and let's get started." The figure was there again, standing just beyond the reach of her light. It was closer now, its features still hidden, but she could make out more of its form. Its limbs were impossibly long, stretched and twisted, and its head was cocked to the side as though watching her with silent, eerie curiosity. Maggie took a step back, her mind racing with thoughts of escape, but her feet felt rooted to the ground. The figure moved, gliding forward without a sound, its body flowing like liquid shadow. She could feel its gaze, cold and piercing, and she was filled with the sudden, overwhelming urge to run. But before she could move, the figure vanished again, melting into the shadows as though it had never been there. Maggie's breathing was shallow and rapid as she stumbled back, her flashlight trembling in her grip. She couldn't stay here, not with whatever that thing was lurking in the darkness. She turned and broke into a run, her footsteps echoing in the silence as she sprinted down the path toward the gate. But as she neared the entrance, she skidded to a halt, her heart sinking. The gate was closed. She'd left it unlocked, hadn't she? She fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking as she tried to find the right one. But as she slid it into the lock, a cold breeze swept over her, and the hair on the back of her neck prickled. She turned slowly, the flashlight clutched tightly in her hand. There, standing just a few feet away, was the figure. It was close enough now that she could make out its face, or the lack of one. Its head was smooth and featureless, a dark void where eyes, a mouth, and a nose should have been. It tilted its head toward her, the darkness seeming to pulse and ripple around it. "Why are you here?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, her hand frozen on the gate. The figure's head tilted again, and for a moment, she thought she could hear something, a low, rasping whisper, like the rustle of leaves. But the sound was just beyond comprehension, a language that twisted and curled around her mind, filling her with a sense of dread. Without another thought, she flung open the gate and bolted out of the cemetery, running as fast as her legs would carry her. She didn't stop until she was halfway home, panting and clutching her chest, her mind reeling from what she'd seen. The next day, she went to the cemetery office and told her supervisor everything. She half expected him to laugh or accuse her of making it up, but his face grew pale, and he looked at her with an expression of horror. "You saw the keeper," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "The keeper?" He nodded, his gaze distant. "It's an old legend. They say the keeper was once a man who watched over the cemetery centuries ago. But he did something terrible, something that cursed him to an eternity in Ravenswood. Now he wanders the grounds, watching, waiting, and he doesn't like intruders." Maggie felt a chill settle over her. "I'm not going back there," she said firmly. Her supervisor nodded, his face grim. "I don't blame you." But that night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her room was quiet, the only sound her own breathing, but she felt the same prickling sensation on the back of her neck. Slowly, she turned her head toward the window. And there, standing in the moonlight just outside her window, was the keeper. His featureless face was tilted toward her, his form as dark and twisted as it had been in the cemetery. Maggie's breath caught in her throat as she scrambled out of bed, backing away from the window. But when she looked back, the figure was gone, leaving only the faint impression of a shadow on the glass. From that night on, the keeper was always there, lurking just at the edge of her vision, waiting and watching. She quit her job, left Fenton Hill, but the keeper followed her, appearing in every dark corner, every shadowed alley. She would catch glimpses of him in reflections, his form blending into the darkness, but always there, always watching. Maggie knew she would never be free of him, that he had marked her somehow. She had seen the keeper of Ravenswood Cemetery, and now he would haunt her forever, a silent, faceless figure, waiting to claim her for the darkness. And no matter how far she ran, she knew that eventually he would find her. In a small town nestled between two darkened hills stood a house everyone avoided. No one knew who had built it, nor why it remained empty for so many years, but rumors swirled about its sinister past. Generations grew up hearing stories of strange lights flickering at night, whispers echoing from empty rooms, and shadowy figures lingering in the cracked windows. It was said the house watched, waited, and held secrets so dark that none who entered would come out the same, if they came out at all. Elena didn't believe in ghost stories. A junior journalist for the local newspaper, she specialized in debunking myths. But when her editor sent her to investigate the house on a dare, Elena accepted, rolling her eyes at the murmurs of her colleagues who warned her against it. "Just a house," she muttered as she stepped through the iron gate, which creaked like a dying scream. She shivered but pushed forward. The air seemed to grow heavier with each step, as if the house was aware of her presence, its silent gaze bearing down on her. The yard was overgrown, and thorny vines snaked up the sides of the building, as if they too were trying to keep people away. When Elena reached the door, she paused. Her fingers tingled as she brushed the tarnished brass handle, a warning shiver dancing up her spine. Laughing nervously at her own reaction, she pushed the door open. It groaned, protesting as though it hadn't moved in decades, and a musty, rotting odor seeped out, thick and nauseating. Inside, the air was stifling, the darkness almost palpable. She flicked on her flashlight, the beam slicing through the murk to reveal peeling wallpaper and warped floorboards. Her footsteps echoed as she ventured into the front hall. The house seemed impossibly large inside, stretching further than it looked from the outside. Rooms branched off in every direction, their doors slightly ajar, as though waiting for someone to enter. "Hello," she called out, but the house swallowed her voice, her words dying in the oppressive silence. As she explored, strange details leapt out. Odd, faint carvings covered the walls, symbols she didn't recognize that twisted and coiled like writhing serpents. Her heart beat faster. No one had said anything about symbols. Determined to capture everything, she pulled out her camera and began to snap photos. She was squatting down, examining a strange pattern of scratches on the floor, when she heard it, a faint, shuffling sound from above, like footsteps dragging across the floor. "Hello," she called again, more forcefully, but only silence replied. Elena climbed the stairs cautiously, each creak of the wood sounding like a scream in the stillness. On the second floor, the atmosphere grew colder. Every few steps, she caught glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision, shadows flitting from room to room, too fast to see clearly. And then she heard it again. Footsteps. But this time they were closer. A chill washed over her. "It's just an old house," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. Old houses make noises. As she reached the top of the stairs, a door at the end of the hallway swung open on its own, creaking slowly. Her hand trembled as she lifted her flashlight and shined it into the room. It was empty, save for an ancient rocking chair sitting in the middle of the floor, gently rocking back and forth. "Wind," she muttered, trying to convince herself. But she could feel it, that unshakable sensation of being watched. She backed away, her eyes never leaving the chair, and that's when she heard it, a whisper, faint and insidious, tickling her ear as though someone was standing right behind her. "Leave," it breathed. She spun around, but no one was there. Heart pounding, she backed down the hallway, but as she turned, she caught sight of something on the wall. Words were scratched into the plaster, letters jagged and angry. "They never leave." Her pulse thundered in her ears. She took a photo of the words, needing proof that she wasn't imagining this, and backed away, her breaths coming in short, sharp gasps. The hallway stretched on endlessly, seeming to warp and twist with each step she took. Rooms blurred together, and her flashlight flickered as if struggling to stay alive. She picked up her pace, desperate to reach the staircase, but when she finally found it, she froze. Standing at the top of the stairs was a figure, shadowy and indistinct, its form shifting and swaying. She could see hollow, empty eyes staring back at her, a face stretched into a grotesque grin. It raised a hand, bony fingers curling as though beckoning her forward. "No," she whispered, stumbling backward. She turned and bolted down the hallway, but the floor seemed to move beneath her feet, stretching and contracting as though alive. She could feel the walls closing in, pressing her forward even as she fought to escape. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of voices echoing around her, filling her mind with fragments of words. "They stay. They stay. They stay." Desperate, she threw herself into one of the rooms, slamming the door shut behind her. She pressed her back against it, gasping for breath, and flicked her flashlight back on. The room was empty except for a large mirror standing in the corner. Something about it seemed wrong. The glass was too dark, almost black, reflecting a distorted version of the room. She forced herself to look, and there, in the dim reflection, she saw herself, but her reflection didn't move with her. Instead, it raised a hand and pointed at her, a twisted smile spreading across its face. Its eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to stare right through her. Panicking, she backed away, but the reflection followed her movements, its smile growing wider, its eyes narrowing with malicious delight. She turned, trying to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The doorknob burned cold beneath her fingers, freezing her hand to the metal. "Let me out," she screamed, pounding on the door. But the house absorbed her cries, muffling them, as if savoring her terror. The mirror began to shimmer, and a voice, thin and raspy, whispered from its depths. "Join us." She shook her head frantically, her eyes filling with tears as her reflection continued to grin. The words carved into the walls flashed through her mind. "They never leave." Suddenly, a hand shot out from the mirror, clawed and pale, reaching for her. She screamed, scrambling back, but the hand caught her wrist, its grip icy and relentless. It began to pull her toward the glass, her own reflection watching with that same wicked smile. "No! Let me go!" she cried, clawing at the floor, but the mirror's pull was stronger. Her vision blurred, her body going numb as the glass swallowed her, pulling her into a world of darkness and shadow. When Elena's editor didn't hear back from her, he sent a few staff members to the house to check on her. They found her camera on the floor in the hallway, her last photograph capturing a blurry reflection of a grinning face in the darkened mirror. There was no sign of Elena herself, only the suffocating silence of the house that watched, waited, and once again held its secrets. The story of the house grew darker after that. The locals whispered of the house that consumed those who dared enter, a place that was forever hungry. For even now, when people passed by in the dead of night, they would see a pale face in the window, hollow-eyed and grinning, as though inviting them to step inside. Eleanor tried to scream, but no sound came. Her mouth was dry, her body frozen, trapped in the web of their music. The figures slowly rose, their movements jerky and unnatural. They circled around her, their hollow eyes boring into her soul. The song grew louder, more insistent, drowning out everything else. The walls of the church began to pulse, as though the building itself were alive, hungry. Eleanor stumbled backward, but her feet refused to obey. She could see the figures now, their bodies emaciated, their limbs stretched and twisted in grotesque angles. Their faces were smooth, featureless except for those black eyes that never blinked, never moved. "You shouldn't have come," a voice whispered, but it was not one of the choir. It came from somewhere deeper, from the very heart of the church. Eleanor turned, her heart racing, and saw something else, a shape, a dark mass, shrouded in black robes, its face hidden in the shadows. "Leave now or join us," the voice continued, its tone low and ancient. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble, the floor cracking as if the church itself were waking from a long slumber. Eleanor fought to break free, her legs finally moving as she turned and ran. But the music, that damned song, followed her, ringing in her ears, growing louder, more distorted with every step. She fled into the night, not stopping until she reached her cabin, gasping for air. But the music didn't stop. It echoed through the trees, louder than before, as though the whole forest was alive with it. That night, as Eleanor lay in her bed, trying to block out the sound, she heard the whisper again, soft and chilling. "They are always watching." The next morning, Eleanor tried to leave Black Hollow. She packed her things, determined to escape the town and its haunting melodies. But when she reached the road that led out of the valley, she found it blocked. The trees had grown too thick, the path consumed by the forest. She tried another road, and then another, but it was the same. Every route was impassable, as though the town itself was holding her captive. The song had found her, and now it would never stop. Months later, when the next anniversary arrived, the townsfolk noticed a new figure in the choir. Eleanor Moss had joined them, her face pale and hollow, her eyes black and empty, her mouth moving in perfect harmony with the others. She was just another voice in the choir, her soul lost to the melody that had claimed so many before her. And so the song continued, growing louder with each passing year, echoing through Black Hollow and beyond, a reminder that once the choir called, no one could escape. It started with a letter, a simple, unassuming envelope that arrived at Emily's doorstep on an autumn evening. She had just moved into the small, dilapidated cottage on the outskirts of the town of Elmswood, seeking a quiet retreat away from the noise of city life. The cottage, nestled at the edge of a sprawling forest, was old, with ivy crawling up the stone walls and a weathered roof that seemed to sag under the weight of years. But it was hers, and for the first time in months, Emily felt a sense of peace. The letter was addressed to her in elegant, looping handwriting. There was no return address, just her name written in ink so dark it almost seemed to bleed through the paper. Curious, she tore open the envelope and unfolded the note inside. "Do not walk too far into the woods. The pines remember those who stray too far, and they do not forget." The message was strange, cryptic. At first, Emily dismissed it as some sort of prank. Elmswood was a quiet town, and people had strange ways of welcoming newcomers. But the words echoed in her mind, gnawing at her curiosity. She glanced out the window at the thick forest that bordered her property, the tall pines swaying gently in the wind, their dark branches reaching toward the sky like gnarled fingers. The next morning, Emily decided to take a walk. She had no intention of venturing deep into the forest, but she wanted to see more of the town. She left her cottage and made her way along the worn path that led to the woods. The air was crisp, the ground covered in a blanket of fallen leaves, their vibrant reds and oranges contrasting with the shadowed green of the trees. She marveled at the beauty of it, the tranquility of the place. But as she walked deeper into the forest, the atmosphere began to shift. The trees seemed to grow closer, their trunks thicker, their branches intertwining to block out the light. The air grew cooler, and the once peaceful forest now felt suffocating, oppressive. Emily glanced around, feeling a chill crawl up her spine. The path had become less defined, the ground softer, as if the forest was slowly reclaiming it. The woods felt alive, watching her every move. She stopped, feeling an unexplainable sense of unease settle over her. Something wasn't right. She turned to retrace her steps, but the path had changed. The The trees seemed to have closed in behind her, the trail now obscured by thick brambles and low-hanging branches. Panic rose in her chest. She took a few hesitant steps forward, trying to push through the underbrush, but the trees around her seemed to shift, twisting in unnatural ways. Then she heard it, a whisper. At first, she thought it was the wind, but the voice was too clear, too purposeful. "Emily." The sound was soft, almost gentle, but it sent a shiver through her body. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The voice had come from behind her, deeper in the woods. It wasn't her imagination. It was real. "Emily, come closer." The voice was different now, darker, more insistent. It seemed to echo all around her, as though the trees themselves were speaking. She spun around, searching the shadows for the source of the voice, but saw nothing. The forest was still. "Leave," the voice whispered, a cold edge to its tone now. "Turn back before it is too late." Her heart pounded in her chest. The letter, the warning. She had ignored it, foolishly thinking it was just a superstition. But now she realized that the woods were not as they seemed. The trees weren't just trees. They were watching her, waiting. Without thinking, Emily turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, her breath ragged in her chest. She had to get back to the cottage. She had to leave. But no matter how fast she ran, the forest seemed to stretch on endlessly. The trees closed in tighter, and the whispers followed her, growing louder with each step. It was as though the very ground beneath her feet had turned against her, urging her deeper into the woods. The whispers now became voices, many voices, all murmuring in a low, guttural hum. They circled her, clawing at her mind. Some were familiar, some were not. They called her name, pleaded with her, begged her to come closer. Emily screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the forest, lost in the chorus of whispers. In the distance, she saw something, a flicker of light through the trees. Her heart surged with hope. The cottage. She could make it. But as she stumbled toward the light, the path shifted again. The trees parted, and she found herself in a clearing. In the center stood a circle of tall, ancient pines, their trunks twisted and gnarled, their roots crawling across the ground like veins. And at the center of the circle, standing in a pool of moonlight, was a figure. A man, or something that resembled a man. His face was obscured by a hood, his features hidden in shadow, but there was something unmistakable about him. He was tall, too tall, with long limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. His hands were long and thin, his fingers sharp like claws, and they reached out to her, beckoning her forward. "Come closer," he whispered, his voice cold as ice. Emily froze. Her body refused to move, as though the very air around her had thickened, holding her in place. "You are the one," the figure continued, stepping forward slowly, his footsteps silent, like the forest itself was muffling his movements. "You are the one who was meant to come." The ground beneath her feet shifted, the earth growing soft and damp. The whispers rose again, more urgent now, circling her like vultures. The trees around her seemed to lean in, their branches stretching toward her, their leaves rustling with a sound that resembled laughter. And then she saw it. From the shadows, something emerged, a dark, shapeless mass, writhing in the moonlight. It was a creature, but it wasn't like anything Emily had ever seen. It had no discernible features, no face, just a shifting, blackened form that seemed to devour the light around it. "We have waited for you," the figure said, his voice now a low, guttural growl. "The pines remember. They remember everything." Suddenly, the ground beneath Emily gave way. She screamed as her feet slipped into the earth, the soil pulling her down like quicksand. The whispers became deafening, a cacophony of voices, and the creature lunged at her, its cold, dark form wrapping around her limbs. With a final, desperate cry, Emily was consumed by the darkness. The next morning, the town of Elmswood was as quiet as ever. The sun rose over the forest, casting its golden light on the trees, but the whispers had ceased. No one saw Emily again. Days turned into weeks, and the locals whispered among themselves. The forest had claimed another one. The pines remembered, and in the quiet corners of the town, those who had ventured too far into the woods began to speak less and less. The trees were always listening, always waiting. No one ever walked too deep into the forest again. But the whispers still lingered in the wind, a warning for the next soul who dared to stray too far. It was a cold, crisp evening when Henry first noticed the station. He had been traveling for hours, the long road twisting through the dense forest as he tried to make his way home after a business trip that had dragged on too long. His car had broken down far from the nearest town, and he'd been forced to walk in search of help. As the night grew darker and the wind colder, he began to wonder if he would even make it out of the woods alive. That's when he saw it. The train station was perched on the edge of a clearing, almost as though it had sprung from the ground itself. It wasn't on his map, and he didn't remember seeing it before when he had driven through the area. The station was old, an old-time relic, like something from the past. The wooden platform creaked underfoot as Henry stepped closer, the faint sound of a whistle echoing in the distance, though no train was visible. The station was dimly lit, with a few flickering lights lining the platform. There was a small, run-down ticket booth, its window cracked and fogged, and an old-fashioned clock on the wall that seemed to be stuck at midnight. Henry squinted, confused, and wiped the mist from the glass. The ticket booth was empty. Curiosity gnawed at him. He had no choice but to investigate. He stepped inside the station, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The air smelled stale, like it had been sitting for years without any sign of life. The walls were lined with faded posters, none of them current, advertising trains to places Henry didn't recognize. As he walked further in, the quiet grew oppressive, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He heard the train whistle again. It was louder this time, almost close enough that it seemed to be right outside the station. He walked quickly toward the platform, glancing up at the station clock. It was still stuck at midnight. When he reached the edge of the platform, he saw the train coming. It was a sleek, black locomotive, though it seemed impossibly long, stretching far beyond the confines of the station. The windows were dark, the train entirely silent except for the occasional hiss of steam. A strange compulsion took hold of him as the train slowed to a stop in front of him. He knew he had no reason to board, no reason to trust this eerie, deserted station, yet his feet moved on their own accord. He couldn't stop himself. As he climbed aboard, the train doors slid open with an unsettling hiss. Inside, the train was even stranger. The seats were upholstered in dark velvet, but the fabric looked worn and torn, as though it had been in use for centuries. The carriages were empty, the soft glow of dim lights casting long shadows along the aisle. He felt an unnatural chill in the air, like something was waiting. He found an empty seat by the window and sat down, unsure of why he had gotten on the train in the first place. The moment he sat, the doors closed, and the train began to move. At first, the ride was smooth. He gazed out the window, watching as the landscape outside blurred into a dark, indistinguishable smear. He couldn't tell if they were moving through trees, fields, or something else entirely. The night sky was pitch black, no stars in sight. Time seemed to stretch out, and Henry found himself growing more and more uneasy. His mind raced with questions. Where was he going? Why was the train so empty? Why hadn't he seen anyone else on the platform? It was then that he heard the footsteps. They were faint at first, soft taps of shoes against the train's metal floor, coming from behind him. Slowly, they grew louder. He turned, but the aisle was empty. He couldn't see anyone. The footsteps continued, though, getting closer and closer until they stopped directly behind him. "Excuse me," Henry called out, his voice breaking through the silence. "Is there anyone there?" No answer, just the faint sound of breathing. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and for a split second, Henry could have sworn he saw a figure sitting across from him in the reflection of the window. A tall, thin man with hollow eyes, staring directly at him. He blinked, but the figure was gone. His heart raced as he looked around, but there was still no one else on the train. The train lurched, and Henry was thrown forward against the seat. His stomach turned as the train seemed to pick up speed, the darkness outside the window becoming more oppressive, as if they were traveling through some sort of endless void. The whispers began then. At first, it was subtle, a soft, barely audible murmur, as if a conversation was taking place just out of earshot. But soon, the whispers grew louder, until the train was filled with them. Low, guttural voices, barely distinguishable, but with an unmistakable sense. The town of Black Hollow was known for its somber air. Nestled deep in the valley, far away from the nearest city, it was a place untouched by modern conveniences and often overlooked by travelers. The town was surrounded by dense, whispering forests, their trees growing tall and dark, and the ground perpetually damp, as though the earth itself soaked in the sorrow of years long past. But it wasn't the isolation that made Black Hollow infamous, it was the sound. The haunting, otherworldly sound that drifted through the town at night. At dusk, as the last rays of sunlight flickered behind the mountains, a soft melody would begin to rise from the forest. It was a choir, or at least it seemed like one, a deep, mournful harmony that echoed across the town, seeping through the cracks of every home. The townsfolk would stop whatever they were doing, their faces drawn and pale, and listen. Some would say it was beautiful, others claimed it was the most terrifying thing they'd ever heard, but all agreed it was impossible to ignore. Every year, as the anniversary of the town's founding approached, the choir would grow louder, its voices more desperate, its melodies more twisted. It was on one such anniversary that Eleanor Moss, a newcomer to the town, first heard the song. She had moved to Black Hollow just a few months prior, eager to escape the bustling city life and start over. But she had never been warned about the music. On her first evening, as she prepared her small cabin for the night, she heard it, a faint hum at first, like the murmur of a distant breeze. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the sound grew louder, a rich, layered harmony that felt almost tangible. She sat in her living room, her knitting needles still, her eyes wide. The music was beautiful, but there was something unsettling about it, as if the song carried with it an unspoken weight. It tugged at her chest, like a memory long forgotten. She opened her door, the cold night air rushing in, and stepped outside. The trees around her swayed, their branches moving in perfect rhythm with the melody. The town was quiet, almost eerily so, as though everyone was waiting for something. The sound seemed to come from deep within the woods, but it was impossible to tell where. Curious but cautious, Eleanor grabbed a flashlight and made her way down the narrow path leading into the forest. The song beckoned her, its sorrowful notes urging her forward. The deeper she walked into the trees, the thicker the fog grew, swirling around her ankles. The light from her flashlight barely pierced the mist, and she found herself struggling to maintain her bearings. But still, she couldn't stop herself. The song, with its aching beauty, held her in its grip. Then, just as she thought she could hear the voices more clearly, the music stopped. Silence fell, heavy and oppressive. Eleanor froze, her breath catching in her throat. She strained her ears, but there was nothing. The woods around her felt too still, too quiet. It was as though the very earth had stilled in anticipation. Suddenly a voice, a single hollow note, rang out from the distance. It was the beginning of the song, but it sounded wrong. It echoed, distorted, like a cry caught in the wind. Eleanor's heart pounded. She knew she should turn back, but the pull of the song was too strong. She pressed on, each step heavier than the last, her mind torn between dread and the irresistible urge to follow. The trees thinned, and she found herself standing in a clearing. In the center stood an old church, its windows dark and shattered, the stone walls weathered by years of neglect. The song came from inside. The door creaked open as if it had been waiting for her. Eleanor hesitated, but then, as if compelled by something deep inside, she stepped forward. The interior of the church was cold, the air thick with dust and decay. Yet, despite the rot, there was something alive about it. The walls seemed to pulse with energy, and the melody filled the space, though she could no longer tell if it was coming from an instrument or a human voice. Her flashlight flickered, the beam dimming, but she barely noticed. She was drawn forward, her feet moving of their own accord. At the altar she saw them, figures cloaked in dark rags, their faces hidden in shadow, their heads bent in solemn prayer. As one, they lifted their heads, revealing eyes that were not eyes at all. Hollow, black pits stared back at her, endless and empty. The choir began to sing again, the sound vibrating through her bones, shaking her to her core. Their voices were not human. They were raw, guttural, a chorus of the damned. Of urgency. Henry couldn't make out the words, but he felt their weight pressing in on him. Who are you?" Henry called out, his voice trembling. "What is this place?" The whispers stopped. The train screeched as it came to another stop, this time in a place Henry didn't recognize. Outside, a thick fog had rolled in, swirling around the train like a living entity. He could barely see beyond the glass of the window, but he thought he saw movement, shadows dancing in the mist. The doors to his carriage slid open with a sickening sound, and before he could even react, a figure appeared in the doorway. It was a woman, pale and gaunt, with long, tangled hair that seemed to float around her face. Her clothes were old-fashioned, a faded dress of another time. She stepped forward, her bare feet silent on the train's floor. Her eyes locked onto Henry's, and he felt a cold shiver run down his spine. "Are you lost?" she asked, her voice high and eerie, as though it didn't belong to her. Henry opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He felt paralyzed, as though the very air around him had turned to stone. The woman took another step forward, and before Henry could react, she was standing directly in front of him, her eyes wide and unblinking. "You're not supposed to be here," she whispered, her voice like ice scraping against metal. "You've taken the last train." The train lurched again, and Henry felt his body being pulled, as if gravity itself were shifting. The train began to move again, but it wasn't the same. It felt slower, heavier, as though it was sinking deeper into the darkness. His head spun, and he gripped the seat in front of him to steady himself. "Get off the train," the woman hissed, her face twisted in an unnatural smile. "It's too late for you. You can't go back." The train's speed picked up, faster now, until everything outside the window was nothing but a blur. The lights flickered and died. The whispers returned, louder than before, an incoherent mass of voices. Henry's heart raced in his chest, and he tried to move, to open the door and escape, but his body refused to obey. Then, with a sudden and terrifying lurch, the train came to an abrupt halt. The doors opened, and a gust of cold wind blew through the train. In the distance, Henry saw a figure standing on the platform, a tall man with hollow eyes, staring at him from the shadows. He knew, without a doubt, that he was never going to leave this train. As the figure stepped closer, the whispers grew silent. The man reached out a hand toward him, and Henry was overcome with a sense of dread so powerful it almost crushed him. "You've arrived," the man said, his voice low and final. "Welcome to the last stop." The next morning, a train station appeared on the outskirts of town. It was old, abandoned, and completely empty, except for a single train that never left. The platform was overgrown with weeds, and the once polished cars were now rusted and covered in dust. No one knew where it had come from or where it was going. But if you stood there long enough, you might hear the faint sound of a train whistle in the distance. And if you listened closely enough, you might hear a voice whispering your name. Of urgency. Henry couldn't make out the words, but he felt their weight pressing in on him. Who are you?" Henry called out, his voice trembling. "What is this place?" The whispers stopped. The train screeched as it came to another stop, this time in a place Henry didn't recognize. Outside, a thick fog had rolled in, swirling around the train like a living entity. He could barely see beyond the glass of the window, but he thought he saw movement, shadows dancing in the mist. The doors to his carriage slid open with a sickening sound, and before he could even react, a figure appeared in the doorway. It was a woman, pale and gaunt, with long, tangled hair that seemed to float around her face. Her clothes were old-fashioned, a faded dress of another time. She stepped forward, her bare feet silent on the train's floor. Her eyes locked onto Henry's, and he felt a cold shiver run down his spine. "Are you lost?" she asked, her voice high and eerie, as though it didn't belong to her. Henry opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He felt paralyzed, as though the very air around him had turned to stone. The woman took another step forward, and before Henry could react, she was standing directly in front of him, her eyes wide and unblinking. "You're not supposed to be here," she whispered, her voice like ice scraping against metal. "You've taken the last train." The train lurched again, and Henry felt his body being pulled, as if gravity itself were shifting. The train began to move again, but it wasn't the same. It felt slower, heavier, as though it was sinking deeper into the darkness. His head spun, and he gripped the seat in front of him to steady himself. "Get off the train," the woman hissed, her face twisted in an unnatural smile. "It's too late for you. You can't go back." The train's speed picked up, faster now, until everything outside the window was nothing but a blur. The lights flickered and died. The whispers returned, louder than before, an incoherent mass of voices. Henry's heart raced in his chest, and he tried to move, to open the door and escape, but his body refused to obey. Then, with a sudden and terrifying lurch, the train came to an abrupt halt. The doors opened, and a gust of cold wind blew through the train. In the distance, Henry saw a figure standing on the platform, a tall man with hollow eyes, staring at him from the shadows. He knew, without a doubt, that he was never going to leave this train. As the figure stepped closer, the whispers grew silent. The man reached out a hand toward him, and Henry was overcome with a sense of dread so powerful it almost crushed him. "You've arrived," the man said, his voice low and final. "Welcome to the last stop." The next morning, a train station appeared on the outskirts of town. It was old, abandoned, and completely empty, except for a single train that never left. The platform was overgrown with weeds, and the once polished cars were now rusted and covered in dust. No one knew where it had come from or where it was going. But if you stood there long enough, you might hear the faint sound of a train whistle in the distance. And if you listen closely enough, you might hear a voice whispering your name. Blackwood Manor had stood for centuries, perched on the hilltop like a shadow over the village below. Its stone walls were weathered by the elements, the windows cracked and boarded up, and the iron gates that once welcomed guests now rusted and twisted, struggling to hold back the encroaching wilderness. No one in the village had dared step near the place for generations, for it was said that the house had its own mind, and that those who went in never came back out the same. When Alice moved to the village, she had heard all the rumors, about the strange disappearances, about the eerie lights that flickered from the upper floors on moonless nights, and most persistently about the candles. They were always mentioned in hushed tones, as if speaking of them too loudly might draw them out of the dark where they belonged. But Alice was a writer, drawn to mystery and things left unsaid. She had to see it for herself. Her arrival had been met with polite nods and wary glances. Alice had rented a small cottage by the river, far from the center of the village, where the houses were close-knit and the gossip was thick. At night, the sound of the wind in the trees was the only thing that kept her company. But her curiosity about Blackwood Manor gnawed at her, especially when the townsfolk would stare out of their windows, crossing themselves as a low, mournful bell tolled in the distance. No one spoke of the house in detail, but everyone seemed to know that it was best to stay away. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Alice's curiosity got the better of her. She had finished her work for the day, the typewriter clicking rhythmically in the dim light of her cottage. She stood and stretched, her eyes falling on the dark silhouette of Blackwood Manor on the hill. It had been a cold day, and the mist from the forest had crept through the village like a living thing. There was no sound except the rustle of the leaves and the distant murmur of the river. Without another thought, she grabbed her jacket and set out toward the manor. The walk was long, and the path was overgrown with vines and weeds. The air grew colder as she ascended the hill, and the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it an unsettling feeling. As she neared the gates, she noticed how the iron seemed to groan in protest, the heavy hinges creaking under the weight of time. The gates were ajar, as if inviting her in, though Alice was aware that something about this invitation felt wrong. Still, she stepped inside. The grounds around the manor were wild, wild with neglect, wild with the forest's desire to reclaim the land. The grass grew thick, and bushes crowded against the house, their twisted limbs clawing at the stone like fingers. The manor loomed ahead, dark windows staring out like empty eyes, its tall, jagged roof cutting into the sky. Alice stood for a moment, her breath fogging the cold air. She had heard that the manor had once been a grand estate, home to generations of the Blackwood family, but the house had fallen into ruin after the mysterious death of Lord Blackwood. His death had been shrouded in rumors, whispers of madness, strange rituals, and the eerie glow of candlelight seen through the manor's upper windows. She glanced around, heart racing with both excitement and fear, but the wind had died, leaving a thick, oppressive silence in its wake. She took a deep breath, pushed open the door, and stepped inside. The moment she entered, the temperature seemed to drop. Her breath came out in visible puffs as she made her way through the entry hall, a massive room with high, vaulted ceilings and portraits of long-dead Blackwood ancestors hanging on the walls. Their eyes seemed to follow her as she walked, the weight of their gazes making her skin crawl. But it was the smell that truly struck her. It wasn't the musty, decaying scent one might expect from a house long abandoned. It was something sweeter, but far more sinister, like the wax of candles that had been burning for years, clinging to the air like a shroud. She reached the end of the hall, where a set of grand double doors stood ajar. The faint glow of light flickered from within. Cautiously, Alice stepped forward and peered into the room. It was a large, dimly lit library, the shelves heavy with dusty books. But in the center of the room was an altar, a stone table covered with cloth, and on it several tall, black candles. They were burning, their flames a deep, unnatural red, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. At first, Alice thought it must be some kind of trick, perhaps a resident spirit trying to lead her deeper into the manor. But the flicker of the flames seemed too deliberate, too alive. Without thinking, she stepped inside, her curiosity overwhelming her sense of caution. She walked slowly toward the altar, her eyes drawn to the candles. They stood in a perfect circle, the wax dripping down like dark tears. The scent of them was intoxicating, filling her senses as though the very air was charged with their presence. Something about the candles felt wrong, though. Their flickering light seemed to cast shadows in ways that didn't make sense, moving against the natural rhythm of the fire. As she reached the altar, she heard the faintest whisper, a voice on the edge of her hearing, as if calling her name. She turned, but there was no one there. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and as she did, the flames grew brighter, their glow intensifying until the room was bathed in a blood-red hue. Alice? Her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't imagining it. The voice was real. Slowly, she turned. Standing in the doorway was a figure, a man tall and thin, with hollow eyes and a pale face. His clothes were old-fashioned, a dark suit of deep velvet that looked strangely out of place in this dilapidated house. His eyes were locked onto hers, and his mouth curled into a slow, unsettling smile. "You shouldn't have come," he whispered, his voice cold and distant. Alice stumbled back, fear seizing her. Her hand brushed against one of the candles, and as if on cue, the room plunged into darkness. The candles were extinguished, but their red glow lingered in the corners of her vision, casting long, twisted shapes against the walls. She turned and bolted, rushing through the dark halls of Blackwood Manor, her footsteps echoing off the stone walls. The air grew heavier with each step, suffocating her, as if the house itself were alive, breathing down her neck. The whispers followed her, soft and insistent, as if the house were speaking directly to her, urging her to stop, to turn around. But Alice couldn't stop. She had to get out. As she neared the front door, she saw the man again, standing just beyond the threshold, blocking her way. His smile had grown wider, more twisted, and the darkness around him seemed to shift like smoke. "You can't leave," he said, his voice now a low, guttural hiss. "Not until you've answered the call." Alice's breath hitched in her chest, and for a moment, she thought she might faint. The door was right in front of her, but it felt miles away, the air thick with dread. The man reached out toward her, his fingers impossibly long and cold. But before he could touch her, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. The walls of the manor cracked, the candles on the altar reigniting with a burst of flame, casting a violent red light across the room. With a scream, Alice lunged forward, pushing through the door and stumbling into the yard. She ran, her legs burning with the effort, until the manor was nothing but a silhouette against the sky. She didn't stop running until she reached the village, the sound of her footsteps echoing through the empty streets. The next morning, Alice was gone. No one had seen her leave the manor, and no one had heard her scream. The townsfolk said they hadn't heard anything at all. But as they went about their day, they couldn't help but notice something strange. The candles in the windows of Blackwood Manor were burning again, their red flames flickering like eyes in the dark. And at night, when the fog rolled in from the hills, the villagers sometimes swore they could see a figure standing at the window, tall, thin, and smiling, waiting. There was something wrong with Hollow Creek, and when Eliza first moved there, she had no idea just how wrong it was. She had come from the bustling city, seeking solace from the noise of her life. The endless deadlines, the pressure, the overwhelming sense of losing herself in the concrete jungle. She needed a break. Hollow Creek, with its quaint cottages and empty roads, seemed like the perfect escape. The little town was hidden away in the hills, far from the chaos of modern life. It felt like stepping into a forgotten world. The locals were quiet, pleasant enough, but distant. They went about their routines in silence, like they were all following the same unspoken rules. Everyone had their place, their own way of life, and no one really questioned the boundaries. Eliza rented a small house on the edge of town, tucked away near the woods. It was a simple place, but it was everything she had hoped for, peaceful, secluded, and just far enough from everyone else to give her the solitude she craved. At first, the isolation was soothing. She'd wake up to the sounds of birds chirping and the distant murmur of the creek, walk through the quiet streets, and spend her evenings reading by the fireplace. But there were moments, subtle at first, that began to disturb her. It was the whispers. They started one night, when she was sitting on the porch with a cup of tea. The air was cool, and the sun had long dipped below the horizon, leaving the world bathed in darkness. The streetlights in Hollow Creek were few and far between, leaving the town in almost complete shadow, the only light coming from the stars overhead. The whispers were faint at first, like a breeze brushing past her ears. She thought it was just the wind, the rustling of the leaves in the trees. But then they grew clearer, soft voices, murmuring just beyond the edge of her hearing. Her heart skipped. She strained her ears, trying to catch the words, but there was nothing distinct, nothing she could understand. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. The next night, the whispers returned, and this time they were louder. She was sitting at her kitchen table when the sound began, so close now that it seemed to vibrate the very air around her. A low, almost rhythmic murmur, like a chant. "Eliza!" Her breath caught in her throat. The voice was not like anything she had heard before. It was soft but unmistakable, like it was calling her name from just around the corner, beckoning her. Eliza stood up quickly, her pulse quickening. She tried to dismiss it as her imagination. She had been under a lot of stress lately, and the isolation was starting to take its toll. But the voice lingered, following her as she moved through the house, until she couldn't ignore it any longer. It wasn't coming from the walls, or the floorboards, or even the windows. No, it was coming from the creek. She could feel the pull, an undeniable force that tugged at her chest, urging her to go outside. Something deep within her hesitated. She had heard the warnings, the townspeople's cryptic remarks when they spoke of the creek, how no one ventured there after dark. They would never explain why, but their eyes always darted away when the topic came up. But the whispers were growing stronger now, louder, almost impatient. There was something wrong with Hollow Creek, and when Eliza first moved there, she had no idea just how wrong it was. She had come from the bustling city, seeking solace from the noise of her life. The endless deadlines, the pressure, the overwhelming sense of losing herself in the concrete jungle. She needed a break. Hollow Creek, with its quaint cottages and empty roads, seemed like the perfect escape. The little town was hidden away in the hills, far from the chaos of modern life. It felt like stepping into a forgotten world. The locals were quiet, pleasant enough, but distant. They went about their routines in silence, like they were all following the same unspoken rules. Everyone had their place, their own way of life, and no one really questioned the boundaries. Eliza rented a small house on the edge of town, tucked away near the woods. It was a simple place, but it was everything she had hoped for, peaceful, secluded, and just far enough from everyone else to give her the solitude she craved. At first, the isolation was soothing. She'd wake up to the sounds of birds chirping and the distant murmur of the creek, walk through the quiet streets, and spend her evenings reading by the fireplace. But there were moments, subtle at first, that began to disturb her. It was the whispers. They started one night, when she was sitting on the porch with a cup of tea. The air was cool, and the sun had long dipped below the horizon, leaving the world bathed in darkness. The street lights in Hollow Creek were few and far between, leaving the town in almost complete shadow, the only light coming from the stars overhead. The whispers were faint at first, like a breeze brushing past her ears. She thought it was just the wind, the rustling of the leaves in the trees. But then they grew clearer, soft voices, murmuring just beyond the edge of her hearing. Her heart skipped. She strained her ears, trying to catch the words, but there was nothing distinct, nothing she could understand. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. The next night, the whispers returned, and this time they were louder. She was sitting at her kitchen table when the sound began, so close now that it seemed to vibrate the very air around her. A low, almost rhythmic murmur, like a chant. "Eliza!" Her breath caught in her throat. The voice was not like anything she had heard before. It was soft but unmistakable, like it was calling her name from just around the corner, beckoning her. Eliza stood up quickly, her pulse quickening. She tried to dismiss it as her imagination. She had been under a lot of stress lately, and the isolation was starting to take its toll. But the voice lingered, following her as she moved through the house, until she couldn't ignore it any longer. It wasn't coming from the walls, or the floorboards, or even the windows. No, it was coming from the creek. She could feel the pull, an undeniable force that tugged at her chest, urging her to go outside. Something deep within her hesitated. She had heard the warnings, the townspeople's cryptic remarks when they spoke of the creek, how no one ventured there after dark. They would never explain why, but their eyes always darted away when the topic came up. But the whispers were growing stronger now, louder, almost impatient. Waverley Station was empty. The streetlights flickered weakly against the deepening fog that had rolled in from the moors. The wind howled through the hollowed-out corridors of the station, sending scraps of paper skittering across the old brick platform. The station was a relic, forgotten by time, left to rot in the shadows of an era that had long passed. It had been years since any trains had stopped there, and no one in the nearby town ever spoke of it anymore, except for the occasional rumor. Those rumors spoke of a train that came at midnight, a train that no one ever saw arrive, but always seemed to be waiting for someone. Claire had heard the stories, but they were just that, weren't they? Stories. There was no reason to believe in them. But when she had been assigned to cover the abandoned station for her small-town newspaper, she found herself, one dark evening, walking the cracked cobblestones of the Waverly platform. The air was thick with the damp scent of the fog, and her footsteps echoed unnervingly against the emptiness. She had been curious, of course. A journalist always was. What had happened to the station? Why was it abandoned? Why had the train stopped running? She had come with her camera, her notepad, and her sense of rational skepticism. Surely, she thought, there was a perfectly logical explanation. As the minutes dragged on, Claire found herself growing more uneasy. Her heart pounded in her chest as she waited for something, anything, to happen. She could hear the sound of the distant wind, but no cars, no footsteps, no sign of life. The train tracks were silent, and there was not a single light on in the station itself, except for a single flickering lamp by the ticket booth. It was almost as if the station were waiting. Her phone buzzed, breaking her out of her trance. She glanced down to see a text message from her editor, asking if she had found anything interesting. Claire shook her head and typed back, "Just fog and silence." Pretty much what I expected. She could feel the weight of the empty station pressing on her shoulders, the sense that something was wrong, even if she couldn't place it. Suddenly, a sound cut through the stillness, a distant, low whistle. Claire's heart stopped for a beat. She stared at the tracks, a cold shiver creeping down her spine. Her breath caught in her throat. There were no trains on this line anymore, she knew that for sure. But the whistle, it was unmistakable. The sound of a train. But that didn't make sense. No one had taken a train to Waverly in over a decade. She squinted into the fog, her pulse quickening. There, in the distance, something was moving. The outline of a train emerged from the mist, impossibly fast, racing towards the station as if it had materialized from thin air. It was an old-fashioned train, black and gleaming, with brass accents that gleamed in the dim light. The wheels clattered and screeched as it came closer, the sound vibrating through the ground beneath Claire's feet. Her mouth went dry. The train slid to a halt at the station, its brakes screeching with an almost painful intensity. The doors opened with a low, groaning hiss, but no one stepped out. It was as though the train had simply appeared out of nowhere, and now it stood at the platform waiting for Claire. Her feet felt like lead, frozen to the ground. She could hear her heart pounding in her ears as she took a hesitant step forward, her camera clutched tightly in her hands. The door to the train swung open wider, inviting her inside. A strange, acrid smell, like burnt tobacco and old leather, filled the air. It was impossible to ignore the pull of the train, like something deep in her mind urged her to board. Then from within the train, she heard a voice. It was deep and gruff, but there was something familiar about it. "Are you getting on, miss?" The voice was coming from the dark interior of the train. It was not quite a question, more of a command. Claire didn't recognize the man's voice, but she knew, deep in her bones, that it was a voice she could trust. It was a voice that seemed to promise answers to the questions she had been asking for so long. Her fingers trembled as she reached out, her breath catching in her throat. She couldn't resist. She had to see where this train was going, had to know why it was here. She climbed aboard. The moment she stepped onto the train, the doors slammed shut behind her, making her jump. The train lurched forward, pulling her into the dark, the fog outside thickening with each passing second. The interior was dimly lit by flickering bulbs, casting long, sharp shadows across the seats. The air smelled stale, like an old attic or a forgotten storage room. The only sound was the steady rhythm of the train's wheels on the track, a monotonous clack-clack-clack that filled the silence. "Where are we going?" Claire managed to ask, her voice shaking as she looked down the long corridor of the train. The man who had spoken before was nowhere to be seen, but she could feel his presence, like a shadow lingering just beyond the corner of her vision. "Waverly," came the reply, though no one was around her. The voice seemed to come from everywhere, filling the cabin as if it had always been there. "We're going to Waverly." A chill ran down Claire's spine. She had never heard of another place called Waverly, and the implication of the words was not lost on her. Was this the same Waverly? Was this a place she knew, or something else entirely? She stumbled backward, gripping the nearest rail for support. The train began to slow. The clacking of the wheels gradually softened, and the air seemed to change, growing heavier, thicker, as though the train were entering some other space, something beyond the normal world. Claire felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. a feeling like a dark premonition, warning her that whatever was ahead, it was not good. She tried to move, but her legs wouldn't respond. Her feet felt like they were stuck in place, as though the floor had become a sticky web. She tugged at the door to the next compartment, but it was locked. She couldn't escape. She couldn't move. The lights flickered once more, and the voice spoke again, but this time, the words were chillingly clear. "Don't look back!" Something inside her screamed in terror, but her head whipped around of its own accord, forced by some dark compulsion. What she saw froze her blood. In the reflection of the window, just over her shoulder, stood a figure. A tall man in a dark coat, his face obscured by the shadows. But there was something horribly wrong about him. His eyes, pale and glazed, were empty, lifeless, staring at her with a hunger that sent a jolt of panic through her. His lips peeled back in a grotesque grin, revealing rows of sharp, yellow teeth. Claire stumbled backward in shock, only to realize that the figure was not reflected in the window. It was standing right behind her. Before she could react, the train lurched to a stop. The doors opened once more. Waverley Station. But it wasn't the same station she had seen earlier. This one was different, darker, older, covered in layers of grime and decay. The platform was empty, save for a few rotting wooden benches and a single flickering lantern. The fog was thick here, swirling like smoke in the cold air. And as she stepped off the train, Claire realized she was no longer alone. The platform was full of figures, pale, thin people, all wearing tattered clothing, their eyes blank, their faces hollow with despair. They shuffled forward, silent and strange, their heads lowered as though they were all waiting for something. Claire's legs trembled. Her chest tightened with the sudden realization. This was not just an abandoned station. It was a place, a limbo, where people came and never left. "You were meant to be here, Claire," the voice said, once more filling the air, now distorted and strange. "You answered the call, and now you'll stay." She tried to scream, but the fog swallowed her words. The train had come for her, and there would be no leaving Waverley. As dawn broke over the moors the next morning, the station was empty once more.